Okay, hi everybody, welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. We changed mods, so today for the next 5 talks I'll be moderating. Thank you again. So now we're gonna have Etienne Maynier talk about defending human rights in the age of targeted attacks. Etienne Maynier is a security researcher and activist working in the Amnesty Tech team on digital surveillance of human rights defenders. He enjoys political discussions, weird malware tricks, hummus, and hate Ilaism, which is the act of talking about oneself in the third person. So thank you and enjoy the talk.
Hi everyone, it's great to be there. I'm sad I couldn't be with all of you in Montreal, but thanks for the NorthSec team to make all the work to make this happen. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you're going to see slides in a bit. It should work now. So I am Etienne Maynier. I'm working for Amnesty Tech. I'm a security researcher. I'm also a research fellow at the Citizen Lab. And so basically I worked in the industry for some years before moving to more this kind of security research. So before getting into the work I do with my colleagues and we do at Amnesty Tech, just a few words about the security industry. So when I started working 10 years ago, I mean, APT was not even a thing. Defensive security was not really taken seriously. The cool people at the conferences were pen testers. Like, of course, you had a few people looking at IDSs, but targeted attacks were not yet a thing. And so it was not really serious. And I think one of the things that, one of the events that changed that a bit was the Aurora attack in 2010, when basically Google said, oh, we were hacked by targeted attacks by Chinese attributed group. And this one of the events that revealed that targeted attacks were a thing. And after that, a lot of companies started to openly say that they were hacked, or more often would not say it, but journalists would still publish about it because everyone was kind of shy about that. But it created quite a big change in the security industry. And so looking back at this 10 years later, the security landscape is pretty different. We now have a lot of people working in threat intelligence, intrusion detection. We have way more tools, services. Passive DNS, for a thing, was like non-existent 10 years ago. And so the industry has evolved to basically change the market, the people working. You now have conferences dedicated to that. Even NorthSec, a large part of the talks are about defensive security. And so the industry now, if you work for any large industry, it's very likely that your company has some boxes to analyze every email, especially attached file entering the network, boxes to analyze every network traffic going out of the network, and so on. If we look more now about what's happening for human rights defenders, one thing we know is that the same attack that target industry and governments also target human rights defenders. One example of that, a month ago, Google, the threat team at Google published an interesting blog post about APT28, also called Sunworm, which is this Russian attributed group, and the evolution of their targets. And if you look in the list, you see of a few companies, automotive, finance, real estate, a lot of government organizations, especially in Ukraine, in the context of the annexation of Crimea. But you also see several organizations that are clearly defending human rights, anti-corruption organizations, charities, LGBTQI, media. And so now we have a lot of evidences that the same groups that targets companies, governments, also target human rights defenders. But the defensive security for human rights defenders, the digital security, is a completely different question. Of course, there are a few large organizations like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and a few others that are kind of organized like companies. And to them, definitely the tools and services that the industry has are also available, even though they are often underfunded compared to a company of the same size, for instance. But most individual and small organizations are actually, human rights defenders are actually mostly individual and small organizations. And for them, it's really hard because first, they are already at risk. They are often threatened and surveilled physically. They are often doing their work in very hard condition, in a very hard situation. let's think about freelance journalists covering like corruption. Let's think about lawyers fighting for human rights in some countries. And so the technology is adding another layer of threat to them, and the impact if they are compromised would be huge. For instance, they could be jailed, they could be killed, or some people they work with could be arrested or killed or forced to leave the country, for instance, sources of journalists and things like that. And if we look at the likelihoods at the same time, they do not have access to the digital security or even the funding that people in companies would have. For instance, often they have limited technical skills. Some people are definitely more tech savvy, but they don't have access easily to people supporting them technically. And they often have limited funding to a point that just buying an Android phone that's up to date could be challenging. So I'm working at Amnesty International. I guess a lot of you have heard or seen this logo. Amnesty is a human rights organization that started in the 60s in London, at first to fight against the imprisonment of political opponents, and then started to tackle more and more other human rights issues. And now Amnesty International is a large organization tackling human rights everywhere in the world. And some years ago, it became obvious for some people at Amnesty that technology was becoming a human rights question too. First, because technology is changing society in a way that can create human rights issues. An example of that is a interesting work done by some of my colleagues last year called Surveillance Giant, that's looking at how the business model of Google and Facebook threaten human rights. Basically gathering private information about billions of people create human rights issues. So that was an aspect of it, all the question about the change in society, artificial intelligence, and so on. But Amnesty is also doing a lot of work to support human rights defenders directly in a lot of different ways. Could be legal support, could be funding, could be a lot of things. And in that work, there is also the fact that human rights defenders more and more are facing digital surveillance as a threat to them. And so there is now another part of the team in which I am, and we are investigating target attacks against human rights defenders. And for that, we have a security lab, what we call a security lab, which is a group of people in different places over the world doing technical investigations. And we do investigation, digital security support, and try to develop tools and technology and share that knowledge. So I'm going quickly through I'm going to go quickly through two examples of reports we published over the past year. I think are two different examples that are interesting and complementary. The first one is about attacks against Uzbekistan human rights defenders. So Uzbekistan, you may know, is this country in Central Asia, former Soviet country. There are a lot of questions about human rights abuse in Uzbekistan. Amnesty and other organizations have raised the issue of forced labor, but also torture and a lot of repression of human rights defenders. One thing to point out about Uzbekistan is that because of this threat intelligence industry in which we are, there are some countries that are researched a lot: Russia, Iran, China. But some other countries are definitely not researched that much. And Uzbekistan is one of these countries where we had very little information about the surveillance there until a few years ago. It has changed quite a bit because of a few reports I'm going to talk about, but also now we know that they were a customer of Hacking Team, for instance, but also Kaspersky has done some work on the group they call SunCat that attribute to the state services. So we now have a bit more information about that. So the first work by Amnesty on actual digital surveillance was in this report called We'll Find You Anywhere in 2017. And if you have the chance to have a look at it, I think it's a very good example about how the impact of targeted attacks is very different for human rights defenders. One of the testimonies there is in this report is from a journalist who created this online media, independent media, trying to cover Uzbekistan called uznews.net. And she was actually hacked. Her mailbox was hacked, and the emails were released online. And that created a lot of trouble for several people in Uzbekistan who were anonymously working with her from Uzbekistan, to a point that several of them had to leave the country and be in exile. And one person in exile from this report is even talking about how he's not even calling his family within Uzbekistan because he's afraid that because of digital surveillance, he would put them at risk of retaliation. So it shows that first, this kind of attacks was already there quite a few years ago. This attack I'm mentioning is from 2014, but also clearly shows this big difference between what the impact is for the industry and what the impact is for human rights defenders. 2 years ago, I was working in late 2018 for a nonprofit called Equality, which is protecting digital website for political organizations. And I was actually doing investigations on this attack. And somewhere in December, I found this weird IP address doing a lot of web scans, pretty basic WordPress scans, these kind of things. But what I found was this one IP was actually used as a proxy to target a lot of websites, and pretty much all of them were related to Uzbekistan. And by digging more, what happened that there was a coordinated attack for 2 to 3 years using a few IP addresses that were doing a lot of web scans, but also hosted phishing domains and use this phishing domain and send phishing emails to several human rights defenders from Uzbekistan. And so that was interesting as for me, a first work on the attacks from this country, but also what's interesting is that this campaign had been running for at least 2 years, 2 to 3 years, without either being researched at all by anyone or without anyone reporting about it, which is also another point about how under-researched some countries are. So last year, when I joined Amnesty, we started to track this campaign, see what's happening, see the change in infrastructure, and we find a few things. First, we found that the campaign continued through a lot of phishing, but also we found more malware. So I'm going to go through quickly the different bits and pieces of it. The first one was a lot of phishing, more than 70 domains, I think. And at first it was pretty basic. It was mostly a fake login page, which is what you see most of the time in phishing. But in May or June last year, we saw them change to use instead a more complex phishing framework. And this phishing tool, instead of just copying the page, would act as a relay between the victim and Google. It's pretty obvious when you find the domain, you see this one, which is one of the domains from the campaign. And when you interact with it, you basically can interact with all the Google services because it's acting as a reverse proxy. And this has one interest, which is that it can bypass most forms of two-factor authentication. For instance, when you log in, you put your login password, then you get this code by text message. And when you enter the code, it would actually work because the code would be sent by the attacker to the real Google server, and the real Google server would give an authorization token that would be recorded by the attacker, which would get access to your account. And this is not new. It was discussed quite a bit in 2016 in the security community. There are a few open source tools out there to do that. But since mostly 2018, mid-2018, I would say, we have started to see this more and more use in the wild. And actually, my colleagues have written a report in December 2018 with a complete different group using the kind of same technique. And so the only thing that protects against this attack is using hardware keys, because the keys would check the domain before putting any token in it. And so we are now recommending more and more to human rights defenders to use this kind of YubiKeys, Hog keys, and all these hardware keys, even though we know it can be hard to use, especially for less technical people. We also found some Windows malware. Nothing really fancy. The Windows malware was a backdoor Telegram desktop with a few tools taken from open source rats, and then some VBS script to gather the password, the cookies, the screenshot, and send them to a remote server. So it was pretty simple and not very complex. And same for the Android malware. Actually, it was an open source, a fork of an open source malware. The only difference was instead of having the C2 hard-coded, it was actually querying a Twitter profile, and this weird string you see in the profile is actually the encoded C2 domain. One interesting thing is that during the investigation, we found one folder with a lot, an open index, completely openly available, and a lot of HTML files. And these were actually templates of phishing email that included the, for some of them at least, the target. So that way we were able to identify several human rights defender targeted and reach out to them. So this was one of the example. You can see it was not very complex technically. The second one I'm going to go through is definitely more evolved, and I will talk a bit later about this difference. My colleagues last year, some of my colleagues did a lot of research in Morocco and identified several human rights defenders targeted by malicious attacks using NSO Group malware. So you may have heard about NSO Group. It's an Israeli company selling malware to governments. And so we identified two different human rights defenders. One is Abdesadek El-Bouchetawi, who is a lawyer. It's especially interesting because he's doing the legal defense of several protesters that were involved in large protests in the north of Morocco. The second human rights defender is Mahati Monjib, who is an historian, but also co-created an organization for the freedom of the press. And between 2017 and 2018, we identified several text messages that were sent to them as an attack, and the link was related to the exploitation infrastructure of NSO Group. So if they had clicked on it, it would have exploited their browser with a 0-day, and their phone with 0-day, and infect their phone with the malware called Pegasus that NSO Group is selling. That basically would wiretap and record everything happening on their phone and send it to a remote server. And we know that because in 2018, an Amnesty International staff member was actually targeted by a similar attack. And when my colleagues discovered that, they did a lot of work to investigate on the infrastructure and were able to find a link between this 2018 NSO infrastructure to deliver exploits and the same attacks we saw targeting Moroccan activists. But from 2018, then we started to see a different kind of attack. Instead of doing text messages, it used network injections. So network injection, how it works, is basically when the phone would connect to a clear text web page through HTTP, there is an element somewhere in the network that would redirect to the exploit link. And so the exploit page would be loaded by the browser, be exploited, and the phone would be compromised. So it's a tool we know is sold by several companies, including NSO Group. And it's a way also to convert a one-click attack, like the text message, into a zero-click attack. So we do not have technical evidence that this is NSO Group, but it makes complete sense for that because NSO Group was already used to attack them just before that they were very likely compromised by actually the same NSO Group tool. So a few words about NSO Group. NSO Group, so it's an Israeli company selling malware to governments, officially to fight against terrorism. But we know we have a lot of evidences that it has been used to target human rights defenders again and again. And just a few examples of that, the Citizen Lab released a report in 2016 showing that it was used to attack a UAE human rights defender, Ahmed Mansour, who is actually now in jail. Several activists in Mexico were also targeted by that same tool. Several people close to Jamal Khashoggi were actually spied by this tool before he was killed. And we've even learned a few months ago that one of the NSO employees used this tool to target a woman he was into some years ago. So we basically learn every few months, we learn a new case where this was used to target activists, journalists everywhere. And there are several legal actions against NSO Group today. One of them, for instance, is WhatsApp suing NSO because of the hack they did of the platform. With Amnesty International, we're supporting actually a legal action in Israel where we take the Israeli Ministry of Defense to court, where we ask to revoke the export license. So the export license is a document that allows NSO Group to sell their tools outside of Israel. So we hope to stop that. So about lessons learned, a few things. The first one is most attacks we see are not technically complex, and they are actually way closer to the Uzbekistan case I show you than the Moroccan case I show you. And there are a lot of discussion in the security community about zero days, very complex and advanced attacks, and I think they're legitimate, but way too often we tend to dismiss the attacks that are not complex, even though they create a big security issue for a lot of human rights defenders in the world. An example of that is people are still hacked in 2020 by malicious macros in Word documents, which is a problem we have known for 15 years or more, maybe even more than that. And still, this is actually still an issue for a lot of people. People get compromised daily by these kind of attacks. So I think we have an issue on that in the security committee, that we focus too much on the cool, new, fancy things and not focus enough on a lot of simple attacks that are actually a big issue. Another lesson is some political contexts are under research. There is a lot of research done on some countries, China, Russia, Iran, and this because of an alignment, I guess, of some government interest and some companies' interest. But there are a lot of countries in which we know very little, and that's an issue because it's very hard to support human rights defenders from these attacks without having knowledge of what's happening. And the last thing is human rights defenders are not reading threat reports. And if you work in a company now, if I publish tomorrow a threat report with a list of malicious domains, it's very likely that these domains will end up in a list of threat feeds somewhere that will be pulled more or less automatically onto a device on your network, and this domain will be blocked. So publishing something directly means often increasing security of companies. This is not working at all for human rights defenders. For it to work, you need to have some people knowing the threats and converting that into direct digital security support to them, helping them to change their hardware, the ways they deal with their websites, doing digital security training, doing long-term support, all this. And this has to work through a chain of people who can convert the knowledge we have about attacks into something that can directly help human rights defenders. So to work on that, we are trying to find some ways to improve this incident detection for human rights defenders. One thing we realized is that for forensic, for instance, we cannot really use cold forensic that's traditionally used in the industry, because we don't have access always to the hard drive. And even if we do, we don't really want to make a complete copy of the hard drive and then take it, because that's access to too much data. So we have worked on a methodology to do live forensic and at least find ways to catch the low-hanging fruits. Check running processes, check autorun, and hope that this is becoming more common, because a lot of attacks are not that complex. It can actually be caught quite easily if you know what to look for. And to help with that, my colleague Claudio Guarnieri has developed several tools. One of them is SnoopDroid, which is an APK, a command line tool to pull APKs from an Android phone, so you can analyze the APKs. Another one is called SnoopDig, which is basically pulling all the interesting information from a system, so you can analyze them later on. So I think I have a few minutes. I would like to use these few minutes to talk a bit more broadly about the issue of technology and human rights. So when I started playing with technology, and I think like some of you in the 90s, mid-90s, it was pretty different, because for one, the internet was way less connected with the rest of society. So you could basically use the internet as a playground to learn and fail sometime without that much risk. But also internet was bringing a lot of hope into creating more openness and democracy in our societies. I mean, Wikipedia was there and everything. And looking back at this from now, it feels like pretty different. First, to see how internet is connected to everything. You can tweet today and create so much trouble with the tweets, or not even talking about hacking a server. But also, like, internet and technology feels that we are jumping a bit more every day into some kind of dystopia. And so clearly technology reflects society issues, and in a lot of places our societies are not doing very well these days. But this clearly shows that technology is political. And so as technologists, developer, hackers, we have a political role to play in that. And often we did not get into technology thinking about that, but we are the best person to both understand how the technology can go wrong, but also to decide how it can be done or how it will be done. And a lot of people don't want technologies to take political position or ethical positions. An example of that is hacking team was organized in a way that there was two different floors, one for the management and one for the technologist, so that the people building the technology would not know how it was used, so that they could not have ethical questions. So maybe they didn't want to, but there was a conscious decision to avoid that. And I think as technologists, we have to jump into this discussion now and be clear that we cannot build technology without having the ethical discussion that should go with it. So what can we do better? I have, of course, there are a lot of answers there. I'm going to go through just two that I find interesting. The first one is just saying don't be evil is clearly not enough. We have learned that a lot, and good intention doesn't lead to good action. So saying don't be evil doesn't help if you don't look at the consequences of what you do. And the first thing I think is important is considering user at risk when we develop technology. And for that, product design makes a lot of difference. When I talk about user at risk, of course, there are human rights defenders, activists, journalists, clearly, and I'm kind of sad to see again and again people fighting with, for instance, bad abuse process in big companies that treat in the same way journalists or media websites and small businesses. But also way too often, women, gender non-conforming people, LGBTQI people are actually user at risk online, especially considering harassment. And so, for instance, harassment is clearly due to a lot of decision in product design. So I think we really should consider that consequences when we build technology. And the last thing is, if I go back to this more specific topic I work on, which is targeted attack against human rights defenders, we need to know more about what's happening. And in many cases, some people doing research on these attacks end up finding information about journalists or activists targeted, but won't do anything with it. And I get that there are a lot of cases where people don't have time, or there is too much pressure, or it's not very interesting for the company, or it's not a big focus. But withholding this information make them completely useless, while in a lot of cases it could be so useful to help human rights defenders be better protected. So I think we really need to improve that kind of connection to make sure that there are ways to share information about attacked human rights defenders and find ways to use information in a better way to improve their security. So that was my talk. I think I am minutes for questions. I'm subscribed to take them. You can, of course, reach out to me online, either on Twitter, by email later on.
Hey, thank you very much. I do agree technology is political. We have to consider this. It's nice to have a talk that is a little bit more light in the middle of the day. We do have a few questions here. Don't hesitate to ask more people if you have some. The first question was, how do you decide which group people to help? Like, how do they contact you? How do you know? Yeah, if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
So I think within Amnesty, it's depend on a lot of things. It could be because, so Amnesty is a large organization and there are sections in many countries and researchers working on human rights issues. So it could be either quite opportunistic, someone is reaching to us to ask for help. It can also be that in some specific region, there is an interest into doing more research there. And so it can be more organized research to try to look at what's happening and discover some surveillance issues. There are also the organizations work in some contexts, so sometimes we just redirect to an organization that's better suited to help in the region. Yeah, I think it's a mix of all that.
Okay, good. Do you have like an email that the organization can contact you directly and ask for help? Like, is it easy to find you guys?
Yes, I can give you can contact me. We don't have an email that we give publicly because we're a bit afraid of being overflown under too many emails. But you can definitely contact me or some people on my team and find us pretty easily online. We have a website where you can also find information about us. So yeah, if you feel free to get in touch if you have anything interesting or.
Good. A second question, are there any specific types of attack that Amnesty Tech thinks will become significant going forward that you'd like the audience to be aware of?
So yes, I can say a few things. I think this, what I mentioned about bypassing two-factor authentication in phishing attacks, I think this will be kind of by default now. We're expecting most groups doing phishing now to be able to bypass most form of two-factor authentication beside hardware keys. I think also we had several cases over the past year to see more attacks against smartphones. And some attacks are using 0-day, but we also had several cases of attacking civil society with old days, basically using bugs in Android that were like fixed a month ago. And because very few people actually have an Android that's up to date, this actually works. So I think this kind of attacks on smartphone are also going to increase. Some with 0 days, but a lot of them just with old days because the Android ecosystem is not working very well for that.
Makes sense. And if you consider as well the digital divide sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
it's a massive issue. Like the discussion we have a lot in the community are about like the other day on iPhone that are updated, but a large part of the planet is having cheap Android phone that never see an update for like years.
yeah.
And that's a big problem, clearly.
Agree. Okay, third question. What quick wins tips could you give to an organization like these trying to first build their defenses? Where to start?
Well, I think there is a first question, which is like working on understanding the threats you have. The focus here in my presentation was a lot on targeted attacks. Depending on your organization, it may or may not be a big issue for you. We see also a website being hacked. You also have to consider often like the physical surveillance you can have, phone tappings. Like you have to consider also different type of surveillance you can face and find solution. And based on that, you can start to build a strategy, and it can go, then it can go in a lot of directions, depending on what you have. I think on the question of specifically targeted attacks, two-factor authentication is making such a big difference. And if you can use hardware keys to protect your mailbox, for instance, like Google has said, we have not seen any successful phishing attempts since we have done that. So on phishing specifically, that's really helpful. And then the problem of malware in general is a bit harder to tackle, especially like if you're a journalist. It's very easy to say, oh, don't open a touch file of people you don't know, but that's not very realistic for journalists. So then you have to find other ways to do that, maybe having a machine just to open them, these kind of things.
There's also probably difficulties if you're in the country and you figure out that you're being spied by your government. Like you do want to take measures to not be spied, but at the same time, legally, you see that you're in trouble potentially. Like, do sometimes they contact you for legal advices too? So, what are their options? Like, do they need to flee the country or?
So yes, there can be some legal advice within Amnesty, which is outside of my team, but there are definitely a lot of lawyers within Amnesty. Clearly, the question is way different if you're within the country or outside of the country. If you're outside of the country, I think targeted attacks are more risk because it's one of the few ways you can be actually targeted. If you're within the country, then there are already a lot of things that can be done without getting into that. For instance, tapping phone calls, geocolating your phones, and also just physical surveillance. And sometimes I talk with people who are at risk and have something weird happening to them, and the answer is more likely to be something kind of less technical, like tapping phone calls. Like that's very classical, and most states have a way to do that. Than target attacks, even though target attacks are quite common.
I see. Good. We'll have time for one last question, asked by an anonymous person again. How can NGOs and other politically inclined organizations or low-fund organizations hope to deal with the very rapid pace of technology? Like, should they have a corporation model or anything that sort of could help them sort of be together and move forward? I guess that's the question.
Okay, that's a very broad question. And I don't know if I can give an answer that just like summarize what you should do. Yeah, I think it really depends about like what the organization is doing. I think for activists and defenders, a lot of people just have, for instance, started to use social network very early in social media because it was the right way to connect to people. But
do you see them organize and cooperate together? Like, for example, journalists from different countries facing not the same threats, but in the end, yeah.
I think there are more and more collaboration, especially on digital security, and there are more and more networks of people facing the same threats. What I also think is that some people stay outside of this network just because they may not know that they exist. And so one of the problems of this network is that they are working pretty well, but some people may be completely excluded without us really knowing it. So one of the things we're trying to do is definitely to reach out to more people outside of this network we know, especially people fighting new fights, especially all the, for instance, indigenous fight, environmental fights that are happening a bit everywhere. I don't know how much these groups are connected with these traditional existing digital security networks.
Agreed. Cool. Well, that's it for today. Would you like to say anything else, or?
No, thanks a lot for having me, and feel free to contact me anywhere on the internet, and hope to see you in Montreal at some point.
Hopefully. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Give us a 10 minutes break for the audience, and then we'll be talking about DMA attacks.